You're fired! Harold Smith's voice echoed through the mansion like thunder, his face red with anger as he pointed at the small bottle of soap bubbles in Hope's trembling hands. The black woman in her simple cleaning uniform stood frozen in the middle of the grand living room, soap suds still floating gently around her. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows of the marble staircase, 8-year-old Ray Smith watched the scene unfold with wide, frightened eyes. "I don't pay you to play games," Harold continued, his expensive suit making him look even more imposing. "I pay you to clean this house, not to make messes with toys." Hope's heart pounded as she clutched the tiny bubble wand. Just moments before, something magical had been happening. Something that hadn't occurred in the Smith mansion for over 3 years. Ray had been smiling. Not just any smile, the first real, genuine smile since his mother died. The first time he had looked truly happy since the car accident that took away the only person who understood his silent world. But now Harold was destroying it all with his anger, and Hope could see Ray shrinking back into the shadows, the brief light in his eyes fading away like the bubbles that were still popping softly in the air around them. "Pack your things and get out," Harold said coldly. "I'll have your final paycheck ready in an hour." As Hope walked toward the servants' quarters with tears in her eyes, she had no idea that her firing would lead to the most shocking discovery of Harold Smith's life, and that in exactly 48 hours, his son would speak his first word in 3 years, changing everything they thought they knew about healing, love, and what it means to be a family. 6 months earlier, Harold Smith stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, looking out at the city he helped build. At 38, he was one of the youngest billionaire CEOs in the country, running a tech empire that employed thousands of people. But for all his success, Harold felt like he was failing at the most important job of his life, being a father. His phone buzzed with yet another message from Dr. Patricia Williamson, the famous child psychologist he'd hired to help his son Ray. "Mr. Smith, I need to discuss Ray's progress. Can we schedule a meeting this week?" Harold sighed. There was no progress. There hadn't been progress for 3 years, not since his wife Maria died in that terrible car accident when Ray was 5. Before the accident, Ray had been a normal, chatty little boy who loved trains and dinosaurs and asking endless questions about everything. He wasn't like other kids. Doctors had diagnosed him with autism when he was 3. But Maria had this amazing gift for reaching him. She would sit with Ray for hours, not trying to force him to talk or behave differently, just being present with him. She understood his need for routine, his sensitivity to loud noises, his way of showing love through gentle touches instead of words. When Maria died, Ray didn't just lose his mother. He lost his translator, his safe harbor, his bridge to the world. For 3 years now, Ray hadn't spoken a single word. He barely made eye contact with anyone. He spent most of his time in his room, lining up his toy cars in perfect rows or staring out the window at the garden his mother used to tend. Harold had tried everything: the best doctors, the most expensive therapists, special schools, behavioral specialists. Nothing worked. If anything, Ray seemed to retreat further into himself with each new attempt to fix him. "Sir?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The cleaning agency is here with your new housekeeper." Harold rubbed his temples. This would be the 4th housekeeper in 6 months. The others had all quit, saying they couldn't handle working in a house with a difficult child. They didn't understand that Ray wasn't difficult. He was just different, and he was heartbroken. Hope Williams climbed the steps to the Smith mansion with a mixture of nervousness and determination. At 28, she had been cleaning houses for 5 years since immigrating from Jamaica, sending most of her small salary back home to support her elderly grandmother. The agency had warned her about this job. "The family has a special needs child," the supervisor had said carefully. The previous housekeepers found it challenging. But Hope wasn't easily scared off. Growing up in Kingston, she had helped her grandmother care for her younger brother Marcus, who had been born with developmental delays. She understood that some children experienced the world differently, and that didn't make them less deserving of love and patience. The mansion was enormous, bigger than any building in her old neighborhood. As the butler led her through room after room filled with expensive furniture and artwork, Hope felt small and out of place. "Mrs. Williams," the butler said formally, "Mr. Smith will meet with you briefly, and then I'll show you your duties. Please remember that the young Master Ray is not to be disturbed. He requires a very quiet, structured environment. Hope nodded, but inside she wondered what kind of 8-year-old needed to live in such silence. Harold Smith appeared in the main hallway, looking exactly like the successful businessman she'd seen on magazine covers. Tall, well-dressed, confident, but there was something tired around his eyes. "Mrs. Williams," he said, shaking her hand briefly. "I trust the agency explained our situation. My son has special needs. He doesn't respond well to strangers or changes in routine. Your job is to maintain the household quietly and efficiently. Ray is not your responsibility. We have professionals for that." "Of course, sir," Hope said politely, though something in his tone bothered her. He spoke about his son like Ray was a problem to be managed, not a child to be loved. "The most important rule," Harold continued, "is that Ray's space and belongings are not to be touched. He has very specific arrangements for his toys and books. Any disruption to his environment can cause—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Difficulties." Hope nodded again, but she found herself wondering what this little boy was like and why his father seemed so afraid of him. For her first week, Hope barely saw Ray at all. She heard him sometimes, the soft sound of his footsteps in the hallway above, or the gentle clacking of his toy cars being arranged and rearranged. The house felt like a museum. Everything was perfect, pristine, and eerily quiet. There were no family photos on display, no children's artwork on the refrigerator, no signs that a little boy lived there except for the occasional glimpse of a small figure darting between rooms. Hope worked efficiently, just as Harold had requested. She dusted the formal living room, polished the marble floors, and maintained the spotless kitchen. But her heart ached for the sadness that seemed to hang over the beautiful house like a gray cloud. On Friday of her first week, Hope was cleaning the main staircase when she finally saw him. Ray Smith was sitting on the top step, almost hidden in the shadows. He was smaller than she'd expected for an 8-year-old, with dark hair that fell across his eyes and pale skin that suggested he didn't spend much time outside. In his hands, he held a small blue car, turning it over and over in a repetitive motion that seemed to comfort him. When he noticed Hope looking at him, Ray didn't run away like she expected. Instead, he just stared at her with the most serious, sad eyes she'd ever seen on a child. "Hello," Hope said softly, not moving closer. "I'm Hope. I help keep your house clean." Ray said nothing, but he didn't look away either. Hope continued polishing the banister, working slowly and quietly. After a few minutes, she glanced up to find that Ray had moved down one step, still watching her. "That's a nice car," Hope said gently, nodding toward the toy in his hands. "What color would you call that blue? It reminds me of the ocean back home." Ray held up the car slightly, showing it to her, but still didn't speak. For the next 20 minutes, they stayed like that, Hope working quietly while Ray observed her from the stairs. It wasn't much, but it was more interaction than Ray had had with any of the previous housekeepers. When Harold came home that evening, Hope mentioned the encounter. "He was watching you?" Harold asked, surprised. "That's unusual. Ray typically avoids new people entirely." "He seemed curious," Hope said carefully. "Maybe he's just getting used to having me around." Harold nodded absently, but Hope could see he was troubled by something. Later, she would learn that Ray's therapists had been encouraging him to isolate less, to engage more with the world around him. But every attempt to force interaction had resulted in Ray withdrawing even further. The breakthrough came during Hope's second week, on a warm Tuesday afternoon. Hope was cleaning the sunroom when she noticed Ray sitting by the large windows that overlooked the back garden. He was holding a different toy today, a small stuffed elephant that looked well-loved and slightly worn. Following his gaze, Hope saw what had captured his attention. The garden was overgrown and neglected, but she could see traces of what it used to be. Rose bushes that needed pruning, a small fountain that had stopped working, flower beds choked with weeds. "Someone used to take very good care of that garden," Hope said softly, not looking directly at Ray, but speaking as if to herself. Ray's grip on the elephant tightened slightly. "I bet it was beautiful when all those flowers were blooming," Hope continued. "My grandmother back home has a garden. She always says that plants need patience and love to grow, just like people." For the first time, Ray turned to look at her directly. Hope felt her heart skip. There was so much pain in those young eyes, but also a flicker of something else, Recognition, maybe, or longing. I could help fix it up, Hope said gently, but only if that's something you'd like. It's your garden, after all. Ray clutched his elephant closer and looked back out at the neglected plants. Then, so quietly Hope almost missed it, he nodded. It was the first time Ray had communicated with anyone in months. When Hope asked Harold about working in the garden, his response was immediate and sharp. "Absolutely not," he said. "Ray's mother used to spend time in that garden. It's too difficult for him. I don't want him getting upset." "But sir," Hope said carefully, "he seemed interested. Maybe being around something his mother loved would be comforting, not upsetting." Harold's face hardened. "Mrs. Williams, I appreciate your intentions, but you don't understand Ray's condition. His doctors have advised us to avoid anything that might trigger emotional responses. The garden stays as it is." Hope wanted to argue, but she needed this job. Instead, she nodded and went back to her regular cleaning duties. But she couldn't stop thinking about the look in Ray's eyes when he gazed at that garden, or the way he had nodded when she offered to help restore it. Over the next few days, Hope noticed Ray returning to the sunroom window again and again, always holding his stuffed elephant, always staring out at the overgrown roses and silent fountain. It was the following Monday when everything changed. Hope was cleaning the main living room when she heard a strange sound, a soft whimpering coming from the direction of the staircase. She found Ray sitting on the bottom step, rocking slightly back and forth. His stuffed elephant had fallen to the floor, and he was staring at it but not picking it up. Hope had seen this kind of distress before with her brother Marcus. Sometimes, when emotions became too overwhelming, simple tasks like reaching for a dropped toy could feel impossible. "It's okay," Hope said softly, sitting down on the floor a few feet away from Ray. "Sometimes things feel too hard, don't they?" Ray's rocking became less frantic, but he still didn't look at her. Hope reached into her cleaning supplies and pulled out a small bottle of dish soap, the kind that made bubbles when you mixed it with water. It was something she'd brought from home, a habit from cleaning her own tiny apartment. Without thinking, she unscrewed the cap and gently blew across the opening. A stream of tiny, perfect bubbles floated into the air between them. Ray stopped rocking. His eyes followed the bubbles as they drifted slowly around the room, catching the afternoon sunlight and reflecting tiny rainbows. Hope blew again, creating more bubbles, and Ray's head tilted slightly as he watched them dance through the air. Then, for the first time in 3 years, Ray smiled. It started small, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth, but as more bubbles filled the space around them, the smile grew wider and more genuine. Ray reached out tentatively and touched one of the bubbles. When it popped against his finger, he looked surprised and delighted. Hope created more bubbles, and Ray began trying to catch them, his earlier distress completely forgotten. For 10 magical minutes, the grand living room was filled with the simple joy of a child playing, something that hadn't happened in the Smith mansion since Maria's death. Ray even made a sound, not words, but a soft, happy humming, as he chased the floating spheres. That's when Harold came home early from work and found them. The anger in his voice shattered the peaceful moment like glass breaking. "What is the meaning of this?" Harold demanded, taking in the scene, bubbles floating everywhere, his son sitting on the floor actually playing, and Hope with the soap bottle in her hands. "Sir, I can explain," Hope began. "You're making a mess. This is completely unprofessional." Harold's voice rose with each word. "I specifically told you that Ray needs a quiet, structured environment." Ray immediately shrank back, the joy disappearing from his face as he huddled against the wall. "I was just trying to help," Hope said desperately. "He was upset and the bubbles seemed to calm him." "I don't pay you to play therapist with my son," Harold snapped. "You're a housekeeper, nothing more." He looked around at the bubbles still floating in the air, at his son cowering on the floor, at Hope standing there with tears in her eyes. "You're fired," he said coldly. "Pack your things and leave immediately." As Hope walked toward the servants' quarters to collect her few belongings, she heard Ray begin to cry. Not the angry, frustrated crying of a tantrum, but the deep, heartbroken sobs of a child who had just lost something precious. She had no idea that her dismissal would trigger a chain of events that would force Harold to confront the most painful truth of his life. That in his desperate attempt to protect his son from more hurt, he had been slowly killing the very thing that could heal him. And in exactly 2 days, when Ray spoke his first word in 3 years, it wouldn't be daddy or help or any of the words his expensive therapists had been trying to coax out of him. It would be hope. The silence in the Smith mansion had never felt so heavy. For 48 hours after Hope's dismissal, Ray hadn't left his room. He refused to eat the meals the temporary housekeeper brought to his door. He wouldn't respond to his father's attempts at conversation. He just sat by his window, clutching his stuffed elephant, staring out at the overgrown garden with empty eyes. Harold paced the hallway outside Ray's bedroom, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. He had been checking on his son every hour, but Ray wouldn't even look at him. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise. Eleanor Rodriguez, Maria's mother, arrived unannounced with her lawyer and a suitcase. "Harold," she said coldly, pushing past him into the mansion. "I've heard about Ray's condition. This has gone on long enough." Eleanor was everything Harold wasn't. Warm where he was distant, emotional where he was controlled, demonstrative where he was reserved. She had blamed Harold for Maria's death from the beginning, convinced that if he hadn't been working so much, Maria wouldn't have been driving alone that night. "What are you doing here, Eleanor?" Harold asked, though he already knew. "I'm filing for custody of Ray," she announced, her lawyer nodding beside her. "That poor child has been neglected and traumatized long enough. He needs a grandmother's love, not whatever cold, clinical environment you've created here." Harold's blood ran cold. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious. Ray hasn't spoken in 3 years under your care. He's clearly suffering, and you're doing nothing about it. A judge will see that he belongs with family who actually cares about his emotional well-being." What Eleanor didn't know was that Ray had spoken. Just one word, just 2 days ago, but Harold couldn't tell her without explaining about Hope, and admitting that he'd fired the one person who had reached his son would only strengthen Eleanor's case. "I want to see my grandson," Eleanor demanded. They found Ray still in his bed, staring at nothing, the stuffed elephant clutched to his chest. "Oh, my sweet boy," Eleanor said, rushing to his side. "Grandmother is here now. Everything is going to be all right." Ray didn't respond to her touch or her voice. He didn't even seem to notice she was there. Eleanor tried everything, singing lullabies Maria used to sing, showing him photos of his mother, offering his favorite snacks, but Ray remained completely unresponsive. After an hour of trying, Eleanor turned to Harold with tears in her eyes. "What have you done to him?" she whispered. "He's like a ghost." That night, Harold sat in his study staring at the legal papers Eleanor's lawyer had served him. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Just 5 days away, he had to find Hope. Harold opened his laptop and began the most important research project of his life. If Hope Williams had come to America from Jamaica, there would be records, immigration documents, work permits, addresses. Using resources that only someone with his wealth and connections could access, Harold traced Hope's path from Kingston to New York. He found her immigration records, her first apartment lease, her employment history. Most importantly, he found her current address. Hope Williams lived in a small apartment in Queens, a 2-hour drive from his mansion in Connecticut. Harold grabbed his car keys without hesitation. Hope's apartment building was a far cry from the Smith mansion. The hallways smelled like cooking spices and cleaning products, and the walls were thin enough that Harold could hear televisions and conversations in multiple languages as he climbed to the 3rd floor. He knocked on apartment 3B with shaking hands. The door opened to reveal Hope in casual clothes, jeans and a simple sweater, looking shocked to see him. "Mr. Smith," she said, confusion evident in her voice. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" "Please," Harold said, his usual commanding presence completely gone. "I need to talk to you. It's about Ray." Hope's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Is he all right? What happened?" "May I come in?" Harold asked. It's complicated." Hope hesitated, then stepped aside to let him into her tiny but immaculately clean apartment. The contrast to his mansion was stark. Everything was second-hand but well cared for, and the walls were covered with photos of family back in Jamaica. "Ray spoke," Harold said without preamble. "2 days after I fired you, he said his first word in 3 years. Hope's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God, what did he say?" Harold looked into her eyes, and she saw the answer before he spoke. "He said your name, over and over. Hope, Hope, Hope. And then when you didn't come..." He stopped talking again. "He won't eat, won't get out of bed. Hope, I think I'm losing him." Tears streamed down Hope's face. "I knew I shouldn't have left him. I could see how much pain he was in, but you said..." "I was wrong." Harold interrupted, his voice breaking. "I was so wrong about everything. I thought I was protecting him, but I was just making everything worse." Hope sat down heavily on her small couch. "Poor baby. He must be so confused, so scared." "There's more," Harold said, sitting across from her. "My mother-in-law is trying to take custody of Ray. The hearing is Friday. She says I've failed him as a father and maybe she's right." Hope looked at him sharply. "Don't you say that. You love that boy. I saw it every time you looked at him, even when you were trying to hide it." "But it wasn't enough," Harold said desperately. "Love wasn't enough. You were with him for 2 weeks and accomplished more than I have in 3 years. He said your name, Hope. Not mine, yours. Take me to him," Hope said suddenly, standing up. "What? Right now, take me to Ray. If he's as bad as you say, then he needs help immediately." Harold felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. "You'll come back?" "I never wanted to leave in the first place," Hope said, grabbing her jacket. "That little boy needs someone who understands him. And Mr. Smith, Ray didn't say my name because he loves me more than you. He said it because I represented safety to him. But you're his father. You're the most important person in his world. He just needs to feel safe with you too." The drive back to Connecticut was silent, both adults lost in their own thoughts. Harold kept glancing at Hope, amazed that this woman, who had every reason to hate him, was willing to help despite how he'd treated her. When they pulled into the mansion's circular driveway, Hope looked up at the imposing building with new eyes. "This place could be a home," she said quietly. "It doesn't have to be a museum." Harold led her quietly through the house to Ray's room. The little boy was exactly as Harold had left him, curled up in bed, staring at nothing, barely moving. Hope knocked gently on the doorframe. "Ray," she said softly. "It's Hope. I'm here." Ray's head turned slowly, and when he saw her, his eyes filled with tears. "Hope," he whispered. Hope rushed to his bedside and gently touched his hand. "I'm so sorry I left, sweetheart. I didn't want to go." Ray sat up slowly, and for the first time since his mother died, reached out to hug another person. Hope held him gently as he cried, and Harold watched from the doorway with tears streaming down his own face. Friday morning arrived too quickly. Despite Hope's return and Ray's gradual improvement over the past few days, Harold still faced the custody hearing with Eleanor. The courtroom was formal and intimidating, but Harold was surprised when Hope appeared beside him. "You don't have to be here," he told her. "Yes, I do," Hope said firmly. "Ray asked me to come." When Eleanor's lawyer presented their case, painting Harold as a cold, neglectful father who had failed to provide proper care for his special needs son, Harold felt his heart sink. Every word was technically true. He had been distant. He had relied too heavily on professionals. He had failed to connect with Ray after Maria's death. But then Hope asked to speak. "Your Honor," she said, standing with quiet dignity, "I've worked in the Smith household for only a short time, but I've seen something that others might miss. Mr. Smith loves his son deeply. His mistake wasn't lack of love. It was fear that his love wouldn't be enough." She turned to look at Harold. "Sometimes grief makes us afraid to get close to people because we're scared of losing them again. Mr. Smith wasn't neglecting Ray. He was trying so hard to protect him that he forgot Ray needed connection more than protection." The judge listened intently as Hope described Ray's breakthrough with the bubbles, Harold's desperate search for her, and the little boy's improvement since her return. "Furthermore," Hope continued, "Ray himself has expressed his wishes clearly. He wants to stay with his father. He just needs his father to learn how to reach him." That's when Eleanor's lawyer made a critical error. "Your Honor," he said dismissively, "this woman is just a housekeeper with no formal training in child psychology. How can her opinion possibly matter in determining what's best for this child?" The judge's eyebrows rose. "Are you suggesting that formal credentials are more important than results, counselor? Because from what I'm hearing, this just a housekeeper achieved in 2 weeks what trained professionals couldn't accomplish in 3 years." At that moment, the courtroom doors opened, and Harold was shocked to see Ray walk in, holding Dr. Williamson's hand. "Your Honor," Dr. Williamson said, "I apologize for the interruption, but Ray insisted on coming. He has something he wants to say." The judge looked down at the small boy with kind eyes. "Hello, Ray. Do you understand what's happening here today?" Ray nodded solemnly. then walked over to Hope and took her hand. Then, surprising everyone, he walked to Harold and took his other hand. "Family," Ray said clearly, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "Hope and Daddy are my family." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. 6 months later, the Smith mansion had been transformed. The formal living room where Harold had fired Hope was now a comfortable family room with soft furniture, books scattered on tables, and yes, a permanent supply of soap bubbles on the coffee table. The neglected garden had been restored to its former beauty, with Ray and Hope working side by side every afternoon, planting flowers and tending to the vegetables that were now growing in neat rows. Harold had made changes too. He worked from home 3 days a week, spent evenings playing with Ray instead of answering emails, and had learned to appreciate quiet moments of connection over constant productivity. Ray was attending a special school that understood his needs, but more importantly, he was talking regularly now. Not constantly. He was still autistic and still processed the world differently, but he communicated his needs, shared his thoughts, and most amazingly, laughed often. Eleanor visited regularly now, having learned to see Harold's love for Ray and accepting Hope as an important part of her grandson's life. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching Ray carefully water his tomato plants, Hope turned to Harold. "You know," she said, "Ray taught me something important too." "What's that?" Harold asked. "Sometimes the most broken things can be healed with the simplest acts of love. I thought those bubbles were nothing special, just a way to distract an upset child. But for Ray, they represented someone finally seeing him as a little boy instead of a problem to be solved." Harold nodded, watching his son gently touch each plant as he watered it, the same careful attention he gave to everything he loved. "Hope," Harold said quietly, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him curiously. "Would you consider staying permanently? Not as a housekeeper, but as family? Ray needs you, and so do I." Hope smiled, the same warm smile that had first reached through Ray's defenses. "Mr. Smith," she said, "I think that little boy taught us both that family isn't about blood or formal arrangements. It's about showing up, staying present, and loving someone exactly as they are." She looked over at Ray, who had finished watering and was now sitting quietly among his plants, humming contentedly to himself. "I've been family since the day I first blew those bubbles," Hope said. "It just took us all a while to realize it." As the sun set over the restored garden, Harold Smith understood something his wealth and power had never been able to teach him, that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, controlled, or managed. They could only be given freely, received with gratitude, and nurtured with patience. Love, he had learned, was a lot like blowing bubbles. It required a gentle touch, the right conditions, and most importantly, the willingness to let go and trust that something beautiful would emerge. Ray looked up from his plants and smiled at both of them. "Bubbles?" he asked hopefully. Hope and Harold exchanged glances and laughed. "Always," they said together. And as they sat in the garden watching soap bubbles drift up toward the evening sky, three people who had once been lost in their own separate worlds of grief and fear had found something better than healing. They had found home. Sometimes the simplest acts of love can break through the strongest walls. And sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect to notice. If you enjoy this story, please like, share, and subscribe.